Mr. President, one of the great things that, one of the privileges really about being in the Senate is actually being to preside, as you're doing right now, to sit in the chair, presiding officer of the Senate, and listen and watch my colleagues talk about issues that matter to them. A lot of times, issues that matter to their states. And, you know, we have this amazing country of ours, so many great states. I get to hear great stories, great traditions when I'm presiding. Some relate to Texas, where the presiding officer is from. And, you know, celebrating our unique traditions while still appreciating that at our best, we share values as Americans together. Opportunity, liberty, justice, fairness really is one of the things that makes the Senate a great body and what makes us strong as a nation. And so, Mr. President, one of the things I like to do is come down to the Senate floor and pass on and talk about some of the traditions in my state. Some of the things that I think makes Alaska the greatest state in the nation. I know some of my colleagues won't fully agree with that, but we all get to brag about our state. And when I do that, I like to talk about this individual who we recognize as the Alaskan of the week. Often somebody who's doing something in a remote part of Alaska that not a lot of people know about that's very, very important. And to share that with my colleagues in the Senate and other Americans watching on TV. And I would like to today, Mr. President, recognize a young Alaskan from Gamble, Alaska, named Chris Apasuguk, a young whaler who's helping to keep the traditions that we have in Alaska, Alaska Native whaling, alive and well, and he is our Alaskan of the Week. So this year, Chris was a keynote speaker at the Elders and Youth Conference, which is a precursor to the Alaska Federation of Natives Conference held each year in one of our cities. It's the largest annual gathering in the United States of any Native peoples, and there's nothing like it in all the country. AFN, as we call it in Alaska, is certainly a highlight of my year. My wife and I and our kids always try to get there. So let me spend a few minutes talking about why Chris's speech about whaling was so important and what happened after he landed a huge bowhead whale in Alaska and why that was so inspiring for so many in my great state, but really around the country. Gamble, Alaska is where Chris calls home. It is a Yupik village about 700 people on St. Lawrence Island on the northwest edge of Alaska. It's one of 11 Alaska communities that participate in 2 whaling seasons recognized and authorized by the International Whaling Commission. And these are subsistence communities. So what does that mean? Subsistence communities, meaning whale meat is actually a necessity in feeding these communities. I should point out that we have no road systems at all in northern Alaska. Most of Alaska has no roads that connect it to community, and certainly not in Gamble. And Mr. President, you and I have had the opportunity to travel around Alaska. You've seen our great state, and you know that many communities are only accessible by air or seasonal barge. Some can only be reached by certain times of the year because of the weather. And these communities need food, and they need whales. The annual bowhead whale migration provides the largest subsistence resource available in these remote areas of our great state. Even so, when a whale is taken, the sharing does not stop with the residents of the community. Each whale produces between 6 and 25 tons of food on average. This meat is shared with other subsistence communities in our state and with family members and elders throughout the state. A hugely important part of Alaska Native culture. And this is another example of the resourcefulness of Alaska Native peoples that have enabled them to survive in the Arctic, some of the toughest weather and conditions anywhere in the world, for millennia, and that have shaped the culture of Alaska and the character of our state today. So back to Chris. He's an extraordinary hunter, even by standards of Gamble, a community of extraordinary hunters. He could aim and shoot a rifle at the age of 5. By 11, he'd trained himself to strike whales. As one writer put it, quote, standing steady in front of the skiff with a gun, riding the Bering Sea swells like a snowboarder. This past April, Chris and his father set out on a boat in the Bering Sea to do what their ancestors have been doing for thousands of years. After they got a bearded seal, they spotted a spouting bowhead. Chris took the first shot, and it was accurate, and it was a huge whale, 57 feet, 11 inches. It took 2 hours to tow it to shore and 4 days for the community to carve it up. As always, when a whale is landed, it's time for celebration in the community, and this time was no different. But, Mr. President, shortly after this, things unfortunately went sour for Chris and the community. A radical special interest activist with a large online following read the story about Chris and the whale, and he began to attack Chris, and so did many of his followers from all across the globe. Hundreds of people, most of them adults, cyberbullying and attacking a 16-year-old boy from Gamble, Alaska, who had at that point only left his village once in his life. Shameful. No respect, no civility, and I mean vicious attacks, Mr. President. I won't repeat them here. It's enough to say that they were greatly upset in the community. Chris, his family, his mother cried all night. Chris was angry that he and his family were being attacked for partaking in this necessary tradition that his community and his ancestors have been doing for thousands of years. Thousands of years. However, this young man, despite the hateful messages from adults who live a world away, despite the names they were calling him, Chris, now 17, cut through the noise, stood strong, gave a great speech at AFN, and he will continue to hunt and feed his family and his community the way his ancestors have done for millennia. At his speech last week at AFN, he said, "Will you stand with me as I continue my hunting traditions of my family?" And the crowd applauded, all of whom rose when he said this. "Will you stand with me as we continue our subsistence activities that we have undertaken for thousands of years?" Mr. President, I hope that everyone across the country stands with this extraordinary young man. Truly brave, courageous, as he continues his traditions and his right to hunt and feed his community. This afternoon, I will be holding a hearing on the Commerce Committee about whaling in Alaska and how necessary it is for subsistence and the survival of these important cultures. I hope that all Americans also stand with so many other proud Alaska whalers in protecting their rights to hunt the way their ancestors have hunted. And thank you, Chris, a young man in Alaska, 17 years old, for standing tall for your people, for all of Alaska. And I also want to thank his parents, Susan and Daniel, for raising such a fine hunter. And congratulations, Chris, for being our Alaskan of the Week.